The courthouse steps were slick with October rain when Rebecca Hayes stepped into the cold morning air, her scarlet letter invisible but burning against her chest. The whispers followed her like shadows, harsh, cutting, final. But across the square, beneath the flickering streetlight, stood a man whose own sins ran deeper than any scandal the town could imagine. When their eyes met through the downpour, something shifted in the universe. This isn't just about second chances. This is about two broken souls discovering that sometimes the most damaged hearts beat strongest together. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing you need to understand about Millbrook, Tennessee, is that secrets don't stay buried there. They fester beneath the surface like infected wounds, waiting for the right moment to split open and poison everything they touch. The town sits in a valley where the Cumberland River bends like a broken spine, surrounded by hills that seem to close in a little more each year, trapping its residents in a web of tradition, judgment, and carefully maintained facades. Rebecca Hayes learned this lesson the hard way on a Tuesday morning in October when the local newspaper ran a front-page story that shattered her life into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She stood in her kitchen, coffee growing cold in her trembling hands, staring at the headline that might as well have been her death warrant. Local teacher's secret life exposed, inappropriate relationship with former student rocks community. Below it, a photograph, her school ID picture next to a grainy shot of her walking out of a downtown hotel, her face turned away from the camera, but unmistakably hers. The words blurred together as she read, each sentence a fresh cut. Hayes, 28, allegedly engaged in a romantic relationship with Marcus Thompson, now 19, beginning when he was a senior in her advanced English class. The relationship came to light when Thompson's girlfriend discovered text messages. Rebecca's phone had been ringing since dawn. Reporters, school board members, neighbors who'd never spoken to her before, but suddenly had plenty to say. She'd stopped answering after the 5th call, but the voicemails kept coming, each one a variation on the same theme: disgrace, disappointment, demands for explanations she couldn't give without destroying what little dignity she had left. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 6 years, she'd been the golden child of Millbrook High School. Teacher of the Year twice running, beloved by students and parents alike, the kind of educator who stayed late to help struggling kids and spent her own money on classroom supplies. She'd poured her whole heart into those teenagers, trying to give them something she'd never had at their age, someone who believed in them. Marcus Thompson had been different from the start. Quiet, intense, with eyes that held too much pain for someone barely 18. His essays were raw, honest, filled with observations about life that cut straight through her professional composure. While other students wrote about summer vacations and college plans, Marcus wrote about his father's drinking, his mother's silence, the weight of carrying secrets that weren't his to bear. She should have maintained boundaries, should have referred him to the school counselor when their after-school tutoring sessions began stretching longer, when their conversations shifted from literature to life. Should have recognized the moment when concern became care, and care became something more dangerous, but she didn't, because Rebecca Hayes, for all her education and professional training, was just as broken as the boy sitting across from her desk, pouring his heart out in perfectly crafted sentences that made her chest ache with recognition. The relationship didn't begin until after graduation. She told herself that made it legal, that waiting until he turned 18 and walked across that stage somehow absolved her of wrongdoing. But she knew better. They both knew better. The connection had been building for months, invisible threads of understanding that pulled them together despite every rational voice screaming for them to stay away. 3 months. That's how long it lasted. 3 months of secret meetings, stolen moments, the kind of desperate intimacy that blooms in the shadows between two people who recognize their own wounds in each other. It wasn't love. Rebecca was honest enough to admit that much to herself. It was needed, raw and consuming, the kind that makes you do things you never thought possible. Marcus ended it first, showed up at her apartment one evening in August with tears in his eyes and maturity that broke her heart. "This isn't fair to either of us," he said, standing in her doorway like he was afraid to come inside. "You deserve someone who can give. You a real relationship, not this hiding, and I need to figure out who I am without using you as an escape from my problems." She'd been proud of him at that moment, even as her heart shattered, proud and ashamed and relieved all at once. They'd agreed to end things cleanly, no contact, no looking back. She'd thought they'd managed it successfully until his girlfriend found those text messages, not recent ones, but old conversations from the height of their relationship, saved on a phone he'd forgotten about. Now, standing in her kitchen with her career in ruins and her reputation destroyed, Rebecca wondered if Marcus was getting the same treatment. Somehow, she doubted it. In towns like Millbrook, there was always a different standard for the young man and the older woman. He'd be seen as a victim, maybe even congratulated by some. She'd be labeled a predator, a cautionary tale, a woman who couldn't control herself. The worst part was that some of it was true. She had violated her position of trust. She had allowed her personal needs to override her professional judgment. She had hurt people who didn't deserve it. Not just Marcus, but her other students who'd trusted her, the parents who'd believed in her, the colleagues who'd stood beside her. The school board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. A formality. Really, they'd already made their decision. Rebecca Hayes, Teacher of the Year, beloved mentor, would be terminated immediately. Her teaching license would be revoked. Her name would become synonymous with scandal in a town that thrived on moral superiority and the fall of those who dared to be human. She'd started packing by noon. There wasn't much to take. Some clothes, a few books, photographs from better and times. The house was a rental anyway, and she'd never put down the kind of deep roots that would make leaving impossible. In some ways, she'd always been prepared for exile, though she'd never imagined it would come like this. As afternoon faded into evening, Rebecca found herself driving aimlessly through the streets of the only town she'd ever called home. Past the high school where she'd spent the best years of her life, past the diner where she'd graded papers over countless cups of coffee, past the courthouse where tomorrow's newspaper would probably feature another story about her disgrace. The rain started as she pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Bar, a dive on the edge of town that she'd never set foot in before, but seemed appropriate for her current circumstances. She needed a drink, maybe several, and the anonymous darkness of a place where nobody knew her as Miss Hayes, the teacher who'd fallen from grace. The bar was nearly empty on a Tuesday night, just a few regulars hunched over their drinks and a bartender who looked like he'd seen enough human misery to be shocked by anything. Rebecca ordered whiskey, something she'd never done in her life, and tried to figure out where to go from here. Millbrook had been her fresh start 6 years ago, her chance to rebuild after college disappointments and family expectations that never quite fit. She'd arrived with big plans and bigger dreams, determined to make a difference in the lives of teenagers who reminded her of herself at that age, lost, searching, desperate for someone to see them as more than their circumstances. Now, she'd have to start over again, somewhere new, with a reputation that would follow her like a shadow. The internet was forever, after all. One Google search, and any potential employer would know exactly why Rebecca Hayes was no longer welcome in her previous position. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a clean pain, honest in a way that nothing else in her life felt right. Now, She was considering ordering another when the bar's heavy wooden door opened, letting in a gust of cold October air, and a man she'd never seen before, but somehow recognized instantly. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and clothes that had seen better days. But it wasn't his appearance that caught her attention. It was the way he moved, like someone carrying invisible weights, like someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be crushed by the expectations of a world that demanded perfection from imperfect people. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and for a moment, Rebecca forgot how to breathe. There was something in his gaze, not pity, not judgment, but recognition. The kind of look that passed between fellow survivors, people who'd walked through fire and lived to tell about it. He ordered bourbon, neat, and took the stool 2 seats, down from hers, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain the pretense of privacy. They sat in silence for several minutes, two strangers united by whatever demons had driven them to seek solace in the bottom of a glass. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "Rough day?" Rebecca almost laughed. The rough day didn't begin to cover it, but she appreciated the understatement. "You could say that." "You?" He nodded, taking a sip of his bourbon before answering. "Rough year, actually, maybe a rough decade. But today was definitely a highlight in all the wrong ways. There was something about his honesty that made her want to match it. I'm Rebecca, and I'm probably the most hated woman in Millbrook, right? About now." He turned to look at her fully then, and she saw that his eyes were green, flecked with gold, and completely without judgment. James Crawford, and I doubt that's true, but even if it were, you'd have some stiff competition for that title. The way he said it, with a self-deprecating smile that didn't quite hide the pain underneath, told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had brought James Crawford to Murphy's bar on a Tuesday night, it wasn't success or happiness or any of the things that normal people celebrated with alcohol. "What's your story?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Maybe it was the whiskey, or maybe it was the relief of finding someone who looked at her like she was still human. James was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he drained his bourbon in one swallow and signaled the bartender. "And for another. You first. What makes the most hated woman in Millbrook drink alone in a dive bar?" "So," she told him, "not everything, not the details that would make tomorrow's headlines even more sensational, but enough. The relationship that should never have happened, the trust she'd violated, the career she'd destroyed, the town that was already writing her obituary in whispers and sideways glances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." James listened without interrupting, his expression never changing, never offering the hollow comfort or moral platitudes she'd been bracing herself for. When she finished, he simply nodded and said, "That takes courage." "Courage?" Rebecca nearly choked on her drink. "I think you mean stupidity, or selfishness, or any number of other words that would be more accurate." "Maybe those too," James said. "But it also takes courage to love someone when you know it's going to cost you everything. Most people don't have the guts to risk that much for another person, even when they should." His words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were kind, kinder than she deserved, kinder than she'd expected from a stranger in a bar at the end of the worst day of her life. "What about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's your story?" James finished his second bourbon and stared at the empty glass like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. When he finally looked up, Rebecca saw a pain so deep it made her chest ache in sympathy. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "the good people of Millbrook are going to learn that their newest resident isn't exactly what he seemed to be." That James Crawford, the guy who's been doing odd jobs around town and keeping to himself for the past 3 months, used to be Detective James Crawford of the Chicago PD. Used to be, until he made a choice that got his partner killed and cost him everything he'd ever worked for. The weight of his confession settled between them like a physical presence. Rebecca found herself leaning closer, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice and the recognition that she wasn't alone in her fall. From Grace. They're going to learn that I came to Millbrook not for a fresh start, but because I was running from an internal investigation, from a family that can't stand to look at me, from a city full of cops who think I'm a coward and criminals, who want me dead. And they're going to learn all of this because tomorrow, the man I came here to hide from is going to walk into their courthouse and drag my past into their perfect little town. The bar suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Rebecca realized that whatever had brought her to this moment, whatever shame and regret she carried, James Crawford was carrying something infinitely heavier. "So you see," he said, his smile bitter and broken, "by tomorrow night you might not be the most hated person in Millbrook after all. You might just have some competition." Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, while inside Murphy's bar, 2 strangers sat in the wreckage of their respective lives and wondered if redemption was possible for people like them. People who'd made choices that couldn't be undone, who'd loved unwisely and paid prices that seemed to grow steeper with each passing hour. Rebecca looked at James Crawford, this broken, honest, quietly courageous man, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not attraction, not yet, but something deeper, recognition, understanding, the beginning of a connection that might prove more dangerous than anything either of them had done before. Because sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, that's when you find exactly what you've been looking for all along. The courthouse bells chimed midnight as Rebecca and James stepped out of Murphy's bar into the October rain. Neither had planned to leave together, but when James offered to walk her to her car, a simple gesture of decency in a world that had shown them precious little, she found herself accepting. The parking lot was slick with fallen leaves and rainwater, reflecting the neon bar sign in fractured patterns of red and blue. Rebecca's hands shook as she fumbled for her keys. Whether from the cold or the whiskey or the weight of everything that had happened, she couldn't say. "Are you okay to drive?" James asked, his voice cutting through the sound of rain on pavement. She almost laughed. Was she okay with anything anymore? "I live 2 blocks away. I think I can manage." That's not what I asked. The simple honesty in his response stopped her cold. When was the last time someone had asked her a direct question and actually waited for a real answer? Not the school board members with their predetermined conclusions, not the reporters with their sensational angles, not even Marcus with his teenage certainty that he could fix everything with the right words. "No," she said, surprising herself. "I'm not okay. I haven't been okay for a long time, and today just made it impossible to pretend otherwise." James nodded, rain dripping from his dark hair. "Want some company while you figure out what comes next?" Rebecca knew she should say no. Should get in her car, drive home, pack the rest of her life into boxes, and disappear before dawn like the scandal she'd become. But something about the way he asked, not pushing, not assuming, just offering, made her reconsider everything she thought she knew about accepting help from strangers. "There's an all-night diner about 10 minutes out of town," she heard herself say. "Neutral territory, if you're willing to listen to someone else's problems for a while longer." The Sunrise Diner lived up to its name, staying open around the clock to serve truckers, shift workers, and insomniacs with nowhere else to go. At this hour, it was nearly empty except for a weary-looking waitress and a trucker in the corner booth, who was more interested in his pie than their conversation. They slid into a booth near the window, where the neon light painted everything, in shades of electric pink, James ordered black coffee. Rebecca asked for hot chocolate, needing something sweet to cut through the bitterness of the day. "So," she said when the waitress had brought their drinks, and retreated to her crossword. "Puzzle. Chicago detective to Millbrook handyman. That's quite a career change." James wrapped his hands around his coffee mug like he was trying to absorb its warmth. "Not by choice. Though I suppose most dramatic life changes aren't." What happened? He was quiet for so long that Rebecca wondered if she'd overstepped. They were strangers, after all, brought together by nothing more than bad timing and shared misery. But then he began to speak, his voice low and careful, like someone handling broken glass. "My partner was Sarah Chen, 5 years younger than me, twice. As smart, fearless in a way that made me worry and proud in equal measure. We'd been working a case for 8 months, a human trafficking ring that was bringing girls in from Southeast Asia, selling them to the highest bidders." Rebecca felt her stomach clench. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this. The operation was run by a guy named Viktor Kozlov, an old-school Russian mob with connections reaching into half the police department. We knew we were getting close when the threats started, first subtle, then not so much. Dead cats on Sarah's doorstep, brake lines cut, phone calls in the middle of the night. James paused to drink his coffee, but Rebecca could see his hands, trembling slightly. The night it all went wrong, we'd finally gotten a break. One of the girls had escaped and was willing to testify in exchange for protection. Sarah and I were supposed to bring her in, get her statement, and start building a case that could take down the whole network. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a steady background noise that somehow made James's words feel even, heavier. But someone tipped them off. Had to be someone on the inside, someone who knew our plan. We walked into that warehouse, expecting to find a scared kid who needed our help. Instead, we found an ambush. Rebecca reached across the table without thinking, covering his hand with hers. His skin was cold, rough with old calluses and newer scars. Sarah took 3 bullets before I even drew my weapon. I got 2 of them, but Kozlov escaped, and Sarah... His voice broke. "She died in my arms while I waited for backup that should have been there 20 minutes earlier. James, I'm so sorry." He pulled his hand away gently, not unkindly, but like someone who'd learned not to accept comfort he didn't deserve. "The investigation found that I'd followed protocol. My actions were justified. Kozlov and his remaining crew disappeared, probably back to Russia or deeper underground. Case closed. Hero cop honored for his service." His laugh was bitter. "Except I knew the truth. I knew that someone in my own department had sold us out, and I couldn't prove it. Couldn't even narrow down the list of suspects because the corruption went too deep." Rebecca felt pieces clicking into place. "So you came here to hide." "I came here to figure out how to live with the fact that I'd failed the one person who trusted me most. And to stay alive long enough to maybe find another way to get justice for Sarah and those girls." The waitress refilled their cups without being asked, her movements automatic and unobtrusive. Rebecca wondered how many broken conversations had played out in this booth over the years, how many confessions had been whispered over coffee and pie in the small hours of the morning. "What changed?" she asked. "You said tomorrow someone from your past was coming here." James's expression darkened. "Kozlov's nephew, Alexei, got arrested in Memphis last week. Small-time drug deal, but he's facing serious time unless he can offer something bigger. Word is he's willing to trade information about his uncle's operation in exchange for a plea deal. That's good news, isn't it? If he can help you find the people responsible." "It's a death sentence," James interrupted. "For him and for me. Alexei doesn't know I'm here, but the moment he starts talking about Chicago, Kozlov's going to put together that his nephew was arrested 2 hours from where the cop who killed his men is hiding out. And then He shrugged. Well, let's just say Kozlov has a long memory and a longer reach. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. So what are you going to do? Leave town before dawn. Disappear again. Find another place to be invisible until the next time my past catches up with me. James looked out the window at the rain-soaked parking lot. It's what I should have done 3 months ago, instead of getting comfortable here. You've been comfortable in Millbrook. For the first time since they'd met, James smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Surprisingly, yeah, it's a good town, full of good people who mind their own business and let a man work in peace. Mrs. Patterson down on Elm Street makes the best apple pie I've ever tasted and always insists I take home leftovers. Old Mr. Garcia taught me how to fix a carburetor properly and never once asked about my past. I even got invited to a few barbecues, though I always found excuses not to go. Why? Because I knew this day would come. I knew I'd have to leave suddenly, and it's easier to disappear when no one's going to miss you. Rebecca understood that logic all too well. She'd spent 6 years in Millbrook building a life, forming connections, letting herself believe she could have a permanent place somewhere. Now she was facing the same choice James had made months ago, run before the consequences caught up, before the people she cared about got hurt by association. Where will you go? James shrugged. West, maybe. Oregon or Washington. Somewhere with lots of trees and not many people. You? The question hung in the air between them. Rebecca realized she hadn't even considered her options beyond packing her belongings and driving away from everything she'd known. I don't know, she admitted. I've never had to completely start over before. When I came to Millbrook, I was running from disappointment, not scandal. This is different. Different. How? Rebecca stirred her hot chocolate, watching the marshmallows dissolve into white swirls. Before, I was running towards something. A chance to teach, to make a difference, to prove I wasn't the failure my family thought I was. Now I'm just running, away, and I'm not sure where you run to when everywhere you go, you'll still be yourself. James was quiet for a moment, then said, You know what the hardest part is. Not the running, not the loneliness, not even the guilt. It's the way you start to see yourself through their eyes, the people who whisper, who judge, who've decided they know your whole story from one headline or one rumor. Yes, the word came, out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every sideways glance, every whispered conversation that had stopped when she entered a room, every former colleague who'd crossed the street to avoid having to acknowledge her. You start to believe you deserve it, James continued. The isolation, the judgment, the punishment, because maybe if you punish yourself hard enough, it'll somehow balance the scales for what you've done. Rebecca felt tears threatening for the first time all day. Not the angry tears of frustration or the desperate tears of panic, but the quiet, exhausted tears of recognition, of finding someone who understood not just what had happened to her, but how it felt to carry that weight. The thing is, James said, his voice softer now, I've spent 8 months punishing myself for Sarah's death. 8 months believing I deserved every sleepless night, every moment of paranoia, every day of exile. But sitting here, listening to you talk about Marcus and what you're going through, I realize maybe we're both wrong. Wrong how? Wrong to think that destroying ourselves honors the people we've hurt. Wrong to believe that suffering somehow makes up for our mistakes. James leaned forward, his green eyes intense in the fluorescent light. What if the real mistake isn't what we did before, but what we're doing now? Running away, hiding, letting our guilt turn us into ghosts instead of people who could maybe somehow make things right. Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of a knot she'd been carrying since the moment she'd opened that newspaper. You're talking about staying. I'm talking about fighting, about stopping the running and facing whatever. It comes next with some dignity intact. James paused. Though I realize that's easier to say when you're not the one facing a murder trial or professional destruction. Professional destruction I can handle, Rebecca said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. It's the rest of it. The way people look at me now, the assumptions they make, the way my own family refuses to return my calls, that's what's killing me. Then maybe the question isn't where we run, but how we stop running. The diner clock read 2:30 a.m., and Rebecca realized they'd been talking for over 2 hours. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the parking lot was empty except for their cars and the trucker's rig. I should go, she said, though she made no move to leave. We both should. Get some sleep before tomorrow brings whatever. Fresh hell is waiting for us. Probably. James signaled the waitress for the check. But before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Okay. Do you regret it? Not the consequences, not the way it ended, but the actual relationship with Marcus, the caring about him, the connection you had. Do you regret that part? Rebecca considered the question, really considered it, beyond the shame and the guilt. And the professional ethics she'd violated. No, she said finally. I regret how it started, how it developed, the position it put him in. I regret that I couldn't find a way to help him that didn't involve crossing lines I shouldn't have crossed. But caring, the connection, the fact that for 3 months, 2 people who were drowning found a way to save each other, even if it was temporary. No, I don't regret that. James nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd been thinking. Then you're not the monster they're making you out to be. Monsters don't lose sleep over the people they've hurt. As they walked back to their cars through the misty night air, Rebecca found herself studying James Crawford's profile in the dim light. There was strength there, beneath the exhaustion and the guilt, the kind of strength that came from facing terrible truths and continuing to function anyway. James, she said as they reached her car, when you said tomorrow someone from your past was coming to Millbrook, how did you find out? His expression grew grim. Anonymous phone call this afternoon. Someone who claimed to be looking out for my welfare. Told me Alexei Kozlov was being transported to testify at the federal courthouse tomorrow morning, and that I had about 12 hours to disappear before things got complicated. Anonymous, Rebecca repeated. But you believed them. When you've spent 8 months looking over your shoulder, you learn to take warnings seriously, even when you can't verify the source. Rebecca felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind, though she couldn't yet see the complete picture. What if it's not a warning? What if it's a trap? James stopped walking. What do you mean? I mean, what if someone wants you in Millbrook tomorrow? What if running away is exactly what they're hoping you'll do? The possibility hung between them like a live wire, dangerous to touch but impossible to ignore. James ran his hand through, his damp hair, his expression thoughtful. If you're right, then I'm walking into exactly the kind of situation that got Sarah killed. But if you run, you'll never know what you might have learned. And you'll spend the rest of your life running from shadows that might not even be real. James looked at her with something that might have been admiration. You know, for someone who supposedly lost everything, you think pretty clearly under pressure. Maybe that's because I've got nothing left to lose. As Rebecca drove home through the empty streets of Millbrook, she found herself thinking not about the scandal that had destroyed her life, but about James Crawford and the choice he was facing. Stay and confront whatever is coming, or run and live forever with uncertainty. She was still thinking about it when she pulled into her driveway and saw the black sedan parked across the street, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. Her blood ran cold as she realized that maybe James wasn't the only one whose past was catching up with them. Maybe in a town like Millbrook, where secrets didn't stay buried, some reckoning were inevitable for everyone. The black sedan was gone. When Rebecca checked her window at dawn, but the impression it had left on her psyche remained. She'd spent the remaining hours until sunrise pacing her small rental house, jumping at every creak of the settling wood, every rustle of wind through the oak tree outside her bedroom. By 7 a.m., she'd given up on sleep entirely. Coffee in hand, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by cardboard boxes, and tried to make sense of the fragments of her life scattered across the worn Formica surface. Teaching awards that now felt like accusations, photographs of students who would probably never speak her name again without disgust, lesson plans for a future that no longer existed. Her phone buzzed with another voicemail. She'd stopped checking them after the 15th call yesterday, but something made her press play on this one. The voice that emerged was older, gravelly with years of cigarettes and disappointment. "Rebecca, it's your father. Your mother saw the news. We're not surprised, honestly. You always did have poor judgment when it came to men. Don't bother coming home. We've got enough problems without adding your scandal to them. Take and care of yourself, I guess." The line went dead, and Rebecca stared at the phone in her hand like it was a snake that had just bitten her. 28 years of life, and her father's response to her crisis was disappointment tempered with relief that she wouldn't be darkening their doorstep. She shouldn't have been surprised. Thomas and Eleanor Hayes had built their lives on appearances, on maintaining the facade of respectability that came with his position as a bank president and her role as president of the church auxiliary. Rebecca's younger brother David was the golden child, Harvard MBA, successful marriage to a senator's daughter, two perfect children who would carry on the family name without blemish. Rebecca had always been the complication, the daughter who asked too many questions in Sunday school, who came home from college with majors her parents couldn't brag about to their friends, who chose teaching over law school despite their carefully laid plans for her future. "Teaching is noble," her mother had said through tight lips when Rebecca announced her decision, "but it's not exactly what we had in mind for someone with your advantages." Those advantages, Rebecca knew, were supposed to have translated into a marriage to someone appropriate, a doctor, a lawyer, another banker, and a life of charity luncheons and country club memberships that would reflect well on the Hayes family reputation. Instead, she'd moved to a small town in Tennessee and thrown herself into work that mattered to her, but mystified them. The irony wasn't lost on her that her parents' worst fears had finally come true. She had become exactly the kind of embarrassment they'd spent years trying to prevent, the daughter whose poor choices would be whispered about in their social circles for years to come. A knock at her front door interrupted her brooding. Rebecca peered through the peephole to see Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of determined kindness. "I brought you some soup," Mrs. Chen said when Rebecca opened the door. "Figured you might not be feeling up to cooking right now." The unexpected gentleness in her voice nearly undid Rebecca completely. After her father's cold dismissal and days of judgment from nearly everyone else in town, simple human kindness felt like a lifeline. "Thank you," Rebecca managed, accepting the warm bowl. "You didn't have to." "Nonsense. You helped my grandson with his college applications last year. Stayed after school every day for 2 weeks to work on his essays. Jimmy got into the States because of you." Mrs. Chen's weathered face was fierce with loyalty. "I don't care what anybody's saying. You're a good person who made a mistake. There's a difference." After Mrs. Chen left, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table eating homemade chicken soup and crying for the first time since the scandal broke. Not the angry tears of frustration or the panicked tears of desperation, but the cleansing tears of someone who'd forgotten that compassion still existed in the world. By mid-morning, she'd made a decision that surprised her. Instead of continuing to pack, instead of fleeing Millbrook like the criminal everyone seemed to think she was going to the courthouse. Not to face formal charges. There wouldn't be any, since Marcus had been 18 and the relationship consensual, but to see if James Crawford was really in the danger he'd described, or if the anonymous warning had been something else entirely. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple grey suit that struck the right balance between professional and penitent. If she was going to make a spectacle of herself, she might as well look dignified doing it. The Millbrook Courthouse was a stately brick building dating back to the 1920s, with wide steps and tall columns that had witnessed decades of human drama. By the time Rebecca arrived, a small crowd had already gathered. She recognized several faces from the school board meeting announcements, along with reporters from the local paper and what looked like federal agents in their unmistakable dark suits and serious expressions. She was scanning the crowd for any sign of James when a hand touched her shoulder. She turned to find Marcus Thompson standing behind her, his young face drawn with exhaustion and guilt. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." Rebecca's first instinct was to walk away. The last thing either of them needed was to be seen together in public, especially with reporters present. But something in Marcus's expression, a desperate urgency that reminded her of the lost teenager who'd first stayed after class to discuss his essays, made her reconsider. "Not here," she said. "Too many eyes." They walked to the small park across from the courthouse, finding a bench partially hidden by old oak trees. Marcus sat beside her with the careful distance of someone trying to maintain propriety in an impossible situation. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't saved those text messages, if I'd been more careful with my phone, none of this would have happened. Marcus, you were 18 years old. You made mistakes because you were young, not because you were evil. The responsibility for what happened is mine. But you're not the only one being punished for it." Marcus's voice was thick with emotion. "My girlfriend broke up with me, which I expected. My parents aren't speaking to me, which I probably deserved. But what they're doing to you, the things people are saying, the way they're treating you like some kind of predator, that's not fair. You're not the person they're making you out to be." Rebecca felt her heart ache for this boy who was trying so hard to shoulder blame that wasn't his to carry. "What's done is done, Marcus. We both have to live with the consequences and try to learn from them." "But that's just it," Marcus said, turning to face her fully. "I don't think the consequences are finished yet. There's something you need to know, something about why this all came out now." Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, the courthouse doors opened and a stream of people began emerging. She spotted James immediately, his tall frame tense with alertness as he scanned the crowd. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw recognition, followed by something that might have been relief. But her attention was quickly drawn to the man walking beside James, a younger man in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see the family resemblance to the photographs James had described. This had to be Alexei Kozlov, the nephew whose testimony was supposed to bring James's past crashing down around him. "Miss Hayes," Marcus said, urgently, "you need to listen to me. The reason my girlfriend found those text messages, the reason she happened to look through that old phone, it wasn't an accident." Rebecca tore her attention away from the courthouse steps. "What do you mean?" "Someone told her where to look. Someone who knew about us, who knew exactly which phone had the evidence, who knew she'd be angry enough to take it to the police." Marcus's face was pale with the implications of what he was saying. Someone wanted this to come out. Someone wanted to destroy you. The pieces clicked together in Rebecca's mind with sickening clarity. The anonymous tip that had led to her exposure, the black sedan outside her house, the timing that coincided with James's crisis, none of it was coincidence. "Who?" she asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. But yesterday, after everything hit the news, I got a phone call. A man with some kind of accent, Russian maybe. He said things might go easier for my family if I kept quiet about how the messages were found. Said there were ways to make problems disappear for people who were smart enough to cooperate. Rebecca felt ice in her veins. Marcus, you need to tell the police about this call. With what proof? It's my word against someone who's clearly connected enough to orchestrate all of this. Marcus stood up, his young face etched with determination that reminded her why she'd cared about him in the first place. But I wanted to warn you. Whatever's happening here, whoever's behind it, I don't think it's finished. I think they used our situation as a distraction, and now they're going to use you as leverage for something bigger. As if summoned by Marcus's words, Rebecca saw two men in dark suits approaching their bench. She recognized the type immediately, federal agents with the kind of grim efficiency that meant business rather than social calls. Miss Hayes, the taller of the two said, flashing a badge. Agent Rodriguez, FBI, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Marcus shot her a look that was equal parts apology and warning before melting away into the crowd. Rebecca found herself facing two stone-faced agents who clearly knew more about her situation than she was comfortable with. Questions about what? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady. About your relationship with Detective James Crawford, Agent Rodriguez said, and about why someone very interested in his whereabouts seems to think you might be useful in drawing him out. The second agent, younger and clearly more aggressive, stepped closer. See, Miss Hayes, we've been tracking communications between members of the Kozlov organization for months, and your name came up in some very interesting conversations about leverage and pressure points. I don't understand. I met James Crawford for the first time last night. Maybe, Rodriguez said, but someone thinks you're important to him. Important enough that threatening you might make him more cooperative about forgetting what he knows about certain criminal activities. The world seemed to tilt around Rebecca as the full scope of her situation became clear. She wasn't just collateral damage in someone else's war. She was ammunition, a weapon to be used against a man she'd known for less than 12 hours, but who had somehow become the first person in months to see her as human rather than scandalous. Where is Detective Crawford now? She asked. The agents exchanged glances. That's classified information, Miss Hayes, but I will tell you this. Your safety may depend on staying as far away from him as possible. As the FBI agents walked away, leaving Rebecca alone on the park bench with the weight of this new revelation, she realized that everything she thought she knew about her situation had been wrong. The scandal, the exposure, the destruction of her life. It hadn't been about justice or consequences or even cruel gossip. It had been about creating a weapon to use against James Crawford. And now, whether she wanted it or not, Rebecca Hayes was at the center of a war she didn't understand, fighting for the life of a man who might be the only person in the world who still saw her as worth saving. The question was, what was she willing to risk to save him in return? As she sat in the shadow of the courthouse where her fate and James's had become inexorably intertwined, Rebecca began to understand that some battles choose you, whether you're ready for them or not. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to fight. The abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of Millbrook had been closed for 15 years, its broken windows and rust-stained walls a monument to the town's faded industrial dreams. It was the last place anyone would think to look for a federal witness or a disgraced teacher, which made it the perfect meeting spot for two people who had run out of safe places to hide. James was already there when Rebecca arrived at sunset, sitting on a concrete loading dock with his head in his hands. The weight of the day's revelations had aged him years in a matter of hours, and Rebecca felt her heart clench at the sight of this strong man brought so low by circumstances beyond his control. "Agent Rodriguez found you too, I assume," she said, settling beside him on the cold concrete. James looked up, his green eyes haunted. 2 hours ago. Told me I was being used as bait, that someone had been feeding information about my location to interested parties, and that my new friend Rebecca Hayes was the leverage they planned to use to keep me cooperative. So we're both pawns in someone else's chess game. Looks that way. James picked up a piece of broken brick and hurled it at the mill's empty doorway. The question is, whose game is it really? Because I'm starting to think the Kozlov angle is just the surface. Rebecca had been wondering the same thing. The timing was too perfect, the orchestration too precise for a simple revenge plot by Russian criminals. Tell me about the corruption in Chicago, the people you suspected of selling you out. James was quiet for a long moment, staring at the abandoned machinery visible through the mill's broken windows. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of betrayals that had been festering for 8 months. There were 3 people who knew the details of our operation that night: me, Sarah, and our lieutenant, Danny Walsh. Danny had been Sarah's mentor before he became our supervisor, training her when she first made detective. She trusted him completely, but you didn't. I wanted to. Danny was a good cop for 20 years, had commendations, respect. But about 6 months before Sarah died, things changed. New car, expensive clothes, started talking about his retirement plans like money wasn't going to be a problem. James picked up another piece of debris, turning it over in his hands. Sarah noticed it too, but she rationalized it. Said maybe his wife's family had money, or he'd made some good investments. Rebecca could hear the regret in his voice, the self-recrimination of someone who'd seen warning signs but hadn't acted on them quickly enough. The night Sarah died, Danny was the one who called in our backup request. Said he'd send units as soon as they were available. Those units didn't arrive until it was too late, and when I asked why, Danny said there had been a communication error, crossed wires in dispatch. You think he delayed the backup deliberately? I think Danny Walsh sold my partner's life for whatever the Kozlov organization was paying him. And I think when the investigation started getting too close to uncomfortable truths, someone decided it would be easier to let me take the blame and disappear than to dig deeper into departmental corruption. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the abandoned mill in shades of gold and red. In the dying light, Rebecca could see the pain etched into every line of James's face, the guilt that had driven him into exile and isolation. But that's not the whole story, is it? She said gently. There's something else, something you haven't told me. James set down the piece of concrete and looked at her directly. You're very good at reading people. Occupational hazard. When you spend your days with teenagers, you learn to spot the things they're not saying. Sarah and I weren't just partners, James said quietly. We were engaged. Had been for 6 months when she died. We kept it quiet because departmental relationships can get complicated, but we were planning to go public after we closed the trafficking case. Rebecca felt something shift in her understanding of James's guilt and grief. This wasn't just about a failed operation or a dead partner. This was about losing the person he'd planned to spend his life with. She was going to quit the force after. We got married, James continued. Said she wanted to teach criminal justice, maybe work with at-risk kids. She had this theory that most criminals weren't born bad. They were just kids who never had anyone believe in their potential to be good. The parallel hit Rebecca like a physical blow. That's why you understood about Marcus, about caring for someone you're supposed to help professionally. Sarah would have understood too. She always said the most dangerous thing about police work wasn't the criminals. It was the way the job could make you stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as categories. Victims, perpetrators, witnesses, problems to be solved. James stood up and walked to the mill's entrance, his silhouette dark against the fading light. The worst part is that I know Sarah would have forgiven me for what happened. She was always better at forgiveness than I was. better at seeing the humanity in people who'd made mistakes. Like you're seeing mine, like we're seeing each other. James turned back to face her. Rebecca, there's something else you need to know about why we're both here. Why our situations got tangled together. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? Agent Rodriguez told me something he probably shouldn't have. The investigation into the Kozlov organization isn't just about human trafficking anymore. They've been branching out, getting involved in all kinds of criminal enterprises, including blackmail and extortion of public officials. The pieces began clicking together in Rebecca's mind with terrible clarity. You think they're connected to my family somehow? Your father is president of First National Bank of Tennessee. That's a position that would give someone access to financial information, the ability to move money without attracting attention, the kind of influence that criminal organizations find very useful. Rebecca sat in stunned silence as implications cascaded through her thoughts. Her father's new car last Christmas, the expensive renovations to her parents' house, her mother's sudden interest in luxury vacations, details she'd attributed to her father's success, but which now seemed ominous in this new context. You think they've been using my scandal as leverage against my father? She said slowly. I think your father may have gotten in bed with the wrong people, and when that became a liability, someone decided his disgraced daughter would make excellent insurance. Keep the family scandal in the headlines. Make sure Thomas Hayes knows. His reputation and his bank's stability depend on continued cooperation. The cruelty of it took Rebecca's breath away. Her personal destruction hadn't been collateral damage. It had been strategic, designed to ensure her father's compliance with whatever criminal enterprise had snared him. That's why he was so quick to disown me, she whispered. Why did he tell me not to come home? He's not just embarrassed by the scandal, he's terrified of what might happen if I get too close to whatever he's involved in. James returned to sit beside her, his presence warm and solid in the gathering darkness. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear about your family. Actually, it makes more sense than anything else that's happened. My parents never cared about my happiness or my choices, but they always cared about appearances. The idea that my father would sacrifice me to protect his position, that sounds exactly like something Thomas Hayes would do. They sat in comfortable silence as night fell around them. Two people whose lives had been shattered by the same criminal organization for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual mistakes and everything to do with their usefulness as weapons against other people. So what do we do now? Rebecca asked finally. Agent Rodriguez wants me to cooperate with their investigation, wear a wire, try to draw out contacts, help them build cases against corrupt cops and criminal organizations. James's laugh was bitter. Same thing that got Sarah killed, except this time I'd be doing it alone. You wouldn't be alone. James looked at her sharply. Rebecca, you can't get involved in this. It's too dangerous, and you've already lost enough. I've lost everything that mattered to me because someone decided to use my life as a chess piece. My career, my reputation, my relationship with my family, all of it destroyed so that criminals could maintain their hold over people like my father. Rebecca felt anger burning away the last of her self-pity and fear. Maybe it's time I stopped being a victim and started being a participant. You don't understand what you're saying. These people killed Sarah without hesitation. They'll do the same to you if they think you're a threat. And they'll do it anyway if we don't fight back. James, they've already proven they can destroy our lives whenever it's convenient. The only question is whether we're going to let them do it from a position of power, or if we're going to make them work for it. James studied her face in the dim light, filtering through the mill's broken windows. You're serious about this? Dead serious. You said Sarah believed most criminals were just people who never had anyone believe in their potential to be good. Well, maybe most victims are just people who never realized they had the potential to fight back. Fighting back got Sarah killed. Running. Away got you 8 months of exile and sleepless nights, and it didn't keep them from finding you anyway. Rebecca took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his attempts to rebuild his life through honest work. I'm not Sarah. I'm not a cop, and I don't have her training or her courage, but I do have something she didn't have. What's that? Nothing left to lose, and sometimes that's the most dangerous thing a person can be. James was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. Finally, he said, "If we do this, if we really do this, there's no going back. Once you cross that line from victim to active participant, everything changes. Everything's already changed. The question is whether we're going to let other people write the ending to our story, or if we're going to write it ourselves." As if summoned by her words, headlights swept across the mill's exterior, followed by the sound of multiple vehicles approaching. James was on his feet instantly, pulling Rebecca behind a concrete pillar as armed figures emerged from black SUVs. "Rebecca." "Hayes," a voice called out in accented English. "James Crawford, we know you're in there. Time to stop playing games and have a civilized conversation about your futures." Rebecca felt James tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward the service weapon he no longer carried. But instead of fear, she found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. "Looks like the decision's been made for us," she whispered. "Last chance to run," James whispered back. Rebecca looked at this man who had seen her at her lowest point and somehow found her worth saving, who had shared his deepest guilt and darkest secrets, who understood better than anyone what it felt like to be broken by circumstances beyond your control. "I'm done running," she said. "How about you?" James squeezed her hand once, hard, and she felt in that gesture all the understanding and partnership that had been building between them since their first meeting in Murphy's bar. "Let's go write our own ending," he said, and together they stepped out into the spotlight to face whatever was waiting for them in the darkness beyond. The man who stepped out of the lead SUV was nothing like the Russian mobster Rebecca had imagined. Viktor Kozlov was in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, with silver hair and the kind of polished demeanor that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than criminal enterprises. He looked like someone who could charm his way into any legitimate business deal, which Rebecca realized was probably exactly the point. "Detective Crawford," Kozlov said, his accent refined rather than threatening. "You've led us quite a chase. 8 months of hide-and-seek across 3 states. Most impressive for a man carrying so much guilt." James stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Rebecca and the armed men flanking Kozlov. "What do you want, Victor?" "Straight to business." "I admire that." Kozlov smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "What I want is simple. I want you to forget certain details about the night my nephew died in that warehouse. I want the federal prosecutors to discover that their star witness has developed amnesia about key aspects of their case. And I want to ensure that neither of you becomes a problem for my organization's continued operations." "And if we refuse?" Rebecca found herself asking, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Kozlov turned his attention to her, his gaze calculating and cold. "Miss Hayes, the schoolteacher who couldn't resist her students' charms, your story has been quite useful to us, I must say. The perfect distraction while we consolidated our interests in this charming little town." "My father," Rebecca said, not bothering to make it a question, "Thomas Hayes has been very accommodating. A man in his position, with access to banking systems and legitimate channels for moving large sums of money, is invaluable to an organization like mine, and a man with a daughter whose scandal threatens his institution's reputation. Well, such a man is motivated to maintain our business relationship. The casual way Kozlov discussed her destruction made Rebecca's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain calm. "So you orchestrated everything, the exposure, the scandal, even bringing James here." "Not orchestrated, that gives me too much credit. I simply recognized opportunities and acted upon them. Your relationship with young Marcus was already a liability waiting to happen. Detective Crawford's location was already known to certain contacts. I merely ensured that both situations developed in ways that served my interests." One of Kozlov's men whispered something in his ear, and the older man nodded. "It seems we have a company approaching. Federal agents, most likely, responding to whatever tracking devices they've undoubtedly placed on both of you, which brings us to our immediate decision point." Kozlov reached into his jacket, and James tensed, but instead of a weapon, he produced 2 cell phones. "Detective Crawford, your phone contains a direct line to Agent Rodriguez. You will call him and explain that you've reconsidered your cooperation with their investigation. You've realized that your memory of certain events may not be as clear as you initially thought, and you no longer feel confident testifying about activities you may have misunderstood." James made no move to take the phone. "And Rebecca?" "Miss Hayes will contact her father and inform him that she's decided to leave Millbrook permanently. No forwarding address, no future contact with family or former colleagues, a complete disappearance that will relieve him of the burden of her continued existence in his sphere of influence." "And if we make these calls?" Rebecca asked. "What guarantee do we have that you'll leave us alone?" Kozlov's smile turned genuinely amused. "My dear girl, you misunderstand the nature of our arrangement. You don't get guarantees. You get the opportunity to live quietly and anonymously, provided you never again become inconvenient to my operations. Consider it a form of witness protection without federal oversight." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Rebecca could see Kozlov's men growing restless. Whatever was going to happen, it needed to happen soon. "You have 30 seconds to decide," Kozlov said, checking an expensive watch. "Make your calls and disappear forever, or refuse and face the consequences of continued interference in matters that don't concern you." James looked at Rebecca, and in his eyes she saw the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. The choice to trust her with his secrets, the choice to believe she was worth saving, the choice to stand with her against forces that had already destroyed so much of both their lives. "James," she said quietly, "remember what Sarah believed about people having the potential to be good." He nodded slowly. "Well, maybe some people also have the potential to be brave when it matters most." Before James could respond, Rebecca stepped forward and took both phones from Kozlov's hands. For a moment, the clearing was silent except for the distant sound of approaching sirens. "You want us to make calls?" she said, her voice carrying a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Fine. We'll make calls." She handed one phone to James and kept the other, watching as hope and fear warred in his expression. This was their moment of choice, not just about survival, but about who they were going to be when everything else was stripped away. Rebecca dialed her father's number, and when Thomas Hayes answered on the second ring, his voice tight with anxiety, she spoke, clearly enough for everyone in the clearing to hear. "Dad, it's Rebecca. I want you to know that I've learned about your business relationship with Viktor Kozlov and his organization. I know how they've been using my scandal to ensure your cooperation, and I know what kind of money has been flowing through your bank." "Rebecca, what are you? You can't—" Her father's voice was panicked, desperate. "I'm calling to tell you that I'm done being your liability and their leverage. I'm also calling to tell you that this conversation is being recorded by federal agents who are very interested in your business practices." She ended the call and looked at James, who was holding his own phone with something that looked like admiration, mixed with terror. "Detective Crawford, Kozlov's voice was no longer polished and reasonable. It was cold, deadly, promising retribution. I strongly advise you to reconsider your next action. James looked at the phone in his hand, then at Rebecca, then at the armed men surrounding them. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of the good cop he'd always been, beneath the guilt and exile. Agent Rodriguez? It's James Crawford. I'm at the old textile mill on Route 9, and I'm ready to testify about everything I know regarding the Kozlov organization. You might want to hurry. I'm currently facing some aggressive encouragement to change my mind. The reaction was immediate. Kozlov barked orders in Russian, and his men raised their weapons. But before anyone could fire, the clearing erupted in flashing lights and shouted commands as FBI agents and local police surrounded the mill from all directions. In the chaos that followed, the tactical teams moving in, the orders to drop weapons, the organized ballet of a law enforcement operation, Rebecca found herself pressed against James's side behind an overturned concrete barrier, both of them breathing hard from adrenaline and the magnitude of what they'd just done. You realize we just declared war on a criminal organization with international connections and unlimited resources, James said, his arm tight around her shoulders. I realize we just stopped letting other people decide what our lives were worth, Rebecca replied. The gunfight when it came was brief but intense. Kozlov's men were outgunned and surrounded, and whatever loyalty they felt to their boss wasn't worth dying for in a Tennessee mill yard. Within minutes, the shooting stopped, and federal agents were securing the scene. Kozlov himself had taken cover behind one of the SUVs, and when Agent Rodriguez approached with his weapon drawn, the older man straightened his tie and smiled as if this were a minor business inconvenience. Agent Rodriguez, he said pleasantly, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply conducting a business meeting with these two individuals about some mutual interests. The kind of business meeting that requires armed security. Rodriguez asked dryly, one can never be too careful in today's climate, but it was Rebecca who delivered the blow that wiped the smile from Kozlov's face. Standing up from behind the barrier, still covered in concrete dust and mill debris, she looked directly at the man who had orchestrated her destruction and said, Agent Rodriguez, you should also know that Victor Kozlov just confessed to orchestrating the exposure of my relationship with Marcus Thompson as a means of controlling my father's cooperation with money laundering operations at First National Bank. The entire conversation was recorded on the phones he provided. Kozlov's composure finally cracked. You have no idea what you've just done, little girl. No idea who you're playing with or what the consequences will be. Actually, James said, standing beside Rebecca, I think we know exactly what we're doing. We're choosing to fight back instead of letting you use our lives as weapons against other people. As Kozlov was led away in handcuffs, still muttering threats in multiple languages, Agent Rodriguez approached Rebecca and James with an expression that mixed admiration with exasperation. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest, he said. Possibly both. Definitely both, Rebecca agreed. But it felt better than hiding. Well, you're not hiding anymore. After tonight, you're both going to be key witnesses in a federal investigation that's going to make enemies you can't imagine. Are you prepared for what that means? Rebecca looked at James, saw the same determination in his eyes that she felt. In her own heart, they'd spent months running from their pasts, letting guilt and shame define their futures. Tonight, they'd chosen to stand and fight, to reclaim their agency in lives that had been controlled by others for too long. Agent Rodriguez, she said, 6 months ago I was a teacher who thought the worst thing that could happen was losing my job. 3 days ago, I thought the worst thing was losing my reputation. Tonight, I learned that the worst thing is losing yourself to fear and letting other people write your story. And, James added, We've decided that whatever comes next, we're going to face it as people who chose courage over safety, even if it kills us." Rodriguez shook his head, but was almost smiling. "In that case, we need to talk about witness protection, federal testimony, and how to keep you both alive long enough to see justice done." As emergency vehicles lit up the night sky and crime scene technicians began processing evidence, Rebecca and James sat together on the tailgate of an ambulance, getting their cuts and bruises treated while contemplating a future that was both terrifying and full of possibility. They'd crossed a line tonight, from victims to active participants in their own salvation. There would be consequences, danger, uncertainty, a life lived in the crosshairs of people who had every reason to want them dead. But for the first time in months, neither of them was running from anything. And sometimes, Rebecca thought as she watched James give his statement to federal agents with the confidence of a man who'd remembered what it meant to be on the right side of justice, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary. The question now wasn't whether they'd survive what was coming, but whether they'd survive it as the people they'd chosen to become tonight. People who refused to let their worst moments define their worth, who'd found in each other's broken pieces the foundation for something stronger than either could have built alone. The federal courthouse in Nashville was a fortress of marble and steel, its imposing columns and bulletproof glass reflecting the gravity of what was about to unfold inside. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the textile mill, 3 weeks of safe houses and depositions, of federal marshals and constant vigilance, of Rebecca and James learning to navigate a world where their very existence was both evidence and target. Now, as Rebecca adjusted the microphone clipped to her blazer and faced a courtroom packed with reporters, federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and spectators who had come to witness the downfall of one of the South's most sophisticated criminal enterprises, she felt a strange calm settle over her. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, a coincidence that had made James smile sadly when they'd first met her, requested. "Rebecca Ann Hayes." "And what is your occupation, Miss Hayes?" "I was a high school English teacher at Millbrook High School until 3 weeks ago. Currently, I suppose, I'm a federal witness." A ripple of murmurs went through the courtroom. Even now, even after everything that had been revealed about the conspiracy that had destroyed her life, Rebecca could feel the judgment in those whispers. The teacher who'd slept with her student, the woman whose moral failings had somehow led to this federal courtroom drama. "Miss Hayes, can you tell the court about your relationship with the defendant, Victor Kozlov?" Rebecca looked across the courtroom at the man who had orchestrated her destruction with the casual efficiency of someone rearranging furniture. Kozlov sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, looking more like a distinguished businessman than a criminal mastermind. His eyes met hers with cold calculation, but she no longer felt the fear that had paralyzed her for months. "I never met Mr. Kozlov until the night of his arrest," she said clearly, "but he had been manipulating my life for approximately 6 months before that meeting, using my personal relationships and professional mistakes as tools to control my father's compliance with his money laundering operations. Can you elaborate on that manipulation?" This was the moment Rebecca had been preparing for, the public accounting that would strip away whatever remained of her privacy, but might finally reveal the truth buried beneath months of scandal and speculation. "In March of this year, I made a personal decision that violated professional ethics. I entered into a romantic relationship with Marcus Thompson, a former student who had recently turned 18. The relationship lasted 3 months and ended by mutual agreement in June." She paused, letting the familiar shame wash over her one last time before continuing. What I didn't know at the time was that Mr. Kozlov's organization had been monitoring my family because of my father's position at First National Bank. When they identified my relationship with Marcus as a potential source of leverage, they arranged for the relationship to be exposed in a way that would maximize scandal and ensure my father's continued cooperation with their criminal activities. Defense attorney Morrison, a sharp-faced man who had probably cost Kozlov more than Rebecca's annual salary, stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating about events she admittedly had no direct knowledge of." "Sustained," Judge Williams said. "Miss Hayes, please confine your testimony to facts you can personally verify." Rebecca nodded. "What I can verify is that in late September I received confirmation from Marcus Thompson that his girlfriend had been contacted by an unknown individual who told her exactly where to find text messages from our relationship. I can also verify that the timing of this exposure coincided with increased pressure on my father to facilitate financial transactions that he later admitted were connected to Mr. Kozlov's organization." Attorney Chen pulled up a series of documents on the courtroom's display screens. "Miss Hayes, do you recognize these financial records?" Rebecca studied the banking documents that Agent Rodriguez had shown her during her debriefing. "Those are transfer records from First National Bank, showing large cash deposits being converted to wire transfers to offshore accounts. The dates correspond to the period when my scandal was dominating local news coverage, and the authorization signatures? Those are my father's signatures, Thomas Hayes, authorizing the transfers in his capacity as bank president." The courtroom stirred as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to the observers. This wasn't just about Russian mobsters or human trafficking. This was about how criminal organizations infiltrated legitimate institutions by turning personal weakness into professional vulnerability. "Miss Hayes," Attorney Chen continued, "when you finally confronted Mr. Kozlov at the textile mill, what did he tell you about your role in his organization's activities?" "He told me that my scandal had been useful as a distraction while they consolidated their interests in Millbrook. He said my father had been very accommodating because a man with a daughter whose scandal threatened his institution's reputation was motivated to maintain their business relationship." "Did he elaborate on what that business relationship involved?" "He said my father's position gave him access to banking systems and legitimate channels for moving large sums of money, which was invaluable to his organization. He also said he hadn't orchestrated everything, but had recognized opportunities and acted upon them." Rebecca glanced at James, who was sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution table. "He'd testified yesterday, his account of Sarah's death and the corruption in Chicago, painting a picture of an organization that specialized in finding people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them with surgical precision." "Miss Hayes," Attorney Chen said, "what was your response when Mr. Kozlov offered you the opportunity to disappear quietly in exchange for ensuring your father's continued cooperation?" This was the question Rebecca had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the moment when her choice at the textile mill would be examined, dissected, held up as either heroic or foolish depending on the observer's perspective. "I chose to call my father and inform him that I knew about his relationship with Mr. Kozlov's organization and that the call was being recorded by federal agents." "Even though you knew this choice would put you in immediate physical danger?" "Yes. Even though you knew it would likely end your father's banking career and possibly result in criminal charges against him." Rebecca felt the weight of that question, the complexity of a choice that had pitted her survival against her father's freedom. But she also remembered the cold calculation in Kozlov's eyes, the casual way he'd discussed her destruction, the years of manipulation that had turned her into a weapon against her own family. "Yes," she said firmly, "because I realized that my father had already made his choice when he decided my life was an acceptable price to pay for his cooperation with criminals. And because I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let other people decide what your life is worth." The defense attorney's cross-examination was predictably brutal. Morrison painted Rebecca as a morally compromised individual, seeking to deflect blame for her own poor choices onto his client. He questioned her motives, her reliability, her relationship with James Crawford, and whether her testimony was colored by a desire for revenge against the organization that had exposed her ethical violations. "Miss Hayes," Morrison said, his voice dripping with condescension, "isn't it true that your relationship with your former student violated the trust placed in you by parents, students, and the community?" "Yes, it is. And isn't it true that you knew this relationship was inappropriate when you began it?" "Yes." "So you're asking this court to believe the testimony of someone who has admitted to violating professional ethics, betraying community trust, and engaging in behavior that resulted in your termination from your position?" Rebecca looked at Morrison, then at Kozlov, then at the packed courtroom full of people who would judge her not just on her testimony, but on the choices that had brought her here. "I'm asking this court to consider the testimony of someone who made serious mistakes and faced the consequences for them," she said. "Someone who learned the difference between accountability and manipulation, between justice and revenge. Someone who chose to tell the truth even when it was dangerous, because the alternative was letting criminals continue to use people's weaknesses as weapons." Morrison pressed on, trying to establish that Rebecca's testimony was motivated by personal vendettas rather than desire for justice. But Rebecca had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, 3 weeks of realizing that her credibility didn't depend on being perfect. It depended on being honest about her imperfections. When the cross-examination finally ended, Rebecca felt drained but not defeated. She told her story, the whole complicated truth of it, and whatever the jury decided, she'd done so with the kind of integrity she'd lost sight of during the worst months of her life. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she saw Marcus Thompson sitting in the back row of the gallery. He'd driven down from Millbrook to hear her testimony. This young man whose life had become entangled with hers in ways neither of them had anticipated. When their eyes met, he nodded slightly. Not approval exactly, but acknowledgement, recognition that they'd both survived something that had changed them in fundamental ways. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by federal marshals and dodging reporters' shouted questions, Rebecca found herself walking beside James toward the black SUV that would take them back to their safe house. "How do you feel?" he asked as they settled into the vehicle's armored interior, "like I just told my entire life story to a room full of strangers and somehow managed not to die of shame," Rebecca said. "How about you? Any regrets about yesterday's testimony?" James had taken the stand the previous day. His account of Sarah's death and the subsequent cover-up painting a devastating picture of corruption that had reached the highest levels of the Chicago Police Department. His testimony had been clinical, professional, devastating, and heartbreaking in its restrained emotion when he described finding his fiancée dying in his arms. "No regrets about the testimony," James said, "but I keep thinking about something Kozlov said at the mill, about how we had no idea who we were playing with or what the consequences would be." Having second thoughts? No. But I think we're about to find out what he meant. Agent Rodriguez, who was riding in the front passenger seat, turned to face them. "We've had some developments while you were in court. Kozlov's organization has been more active than we anticipated in response to the trial. 3 witnesses in similar cases have received threats in the past 48 hours, and there's been chatter about making examples of people who cooperate with federal investigations. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the SUV's air conditioning. What kind of examples? The kind that sends messages to other potential witnesses about the cost of testifying against criminal organizations. James's hand found hers, in the space between their seats. How long until the trial ends? Closing arguments are next week. Jury deliberation could take anywhere from hours to days, depending on how much the defense can muddy the waters around witness credibility and prosecutorial overreach. As their convoy wound through Nashville traffic toward another anonymous safe house in another forgettable suburb, Rebecca reflected on how much her life had changed in the span of a month. A few weeks ago, her biggest concern had been packing her belongings and finding somewhere to disappear. Now, she was a key witness in a federal prosecution that would either bring down a major criminal organization or result in her spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. But she wasn't afraid. Not the way she'd been afraid in those early days after the scandal broke, when shame and uncertainty had paralyzed her ability to see any future beyond exile and regret. This was a different kind of fear, sharp, immediate, but coupled with purpose. She was afraid of what might happen, but she was no longer afraid of who she was or what she'd chosen to become. "Rebecca," James said quietly as they pulled into another nondescript driveway, "whatever happens when this trial ends, I want you to know that meeting you changed my life. Not just because of what we've been through together, but because you reminded me that broken people can still choose to do brave things." She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a man who'd rebuilt himself through honest work and quiet determination. "The feeling's mutual," she said. "Though I have to say, when I walked into Murphy's bar 3 weeks ago, I never imagined it would lead to federal witness protection and death threats. Any regrets?" Rebecca considered the question as they were escorted into another temporary home, another way station in a life that had become defined by movement and vigilance. Did she regret the choices that had brought her here? The relationship with Marcus that had started it all? The decision to trust James with her story? The moment at the textile mill when they'd chosen courage over safety? "Ask me again when we know how this ends," she said. "But right now, no. No regrets about becoming someone who fights back." As federal marshals swept the safe house and established their security perimeter, Rebecca stood at a window looking out at a neighborhood where ordinary people were living ordinary lives. Unaware that a few blocks away, 2 witnesses in a federal trial were wondering if they'd live long enough to see justice done. But for the first time in months, she wasn't wondering if she'd made the right choice. She was only wondering what choice she'd have to make next, and whether she'd have the courage to make it when the time came. Outside, the sun was setting over Nashville, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that reminded her of that night at the textile mill when everything had changed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to discover what she was made of when everything else was stripped away. Tonight, she was alive, she was free, and she was no longer afraid of her own story. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the small classroom in Portland, Oregon, casting golden rectangles across rows of desks where 30 adult students sat focused on their GED preparation materials. Rebecca moved quietly between the desks, offering gentle corrections and encouragement to people who had found the courage to chase dreams they'd thought were lost forever. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, stopping beside a woman in her 40s who was struggling with an essay about overcoming adversity. "Remember what we discussed about showing rather than telling. Don't just say the experience changed you, show us how." Carmen Rodriguez looked up with eyes that held familiar shadows. Like many of Rebecca's students at the Second Chance Learning Center, Carmen carried stories of mistakes made, bridges burned, chances lost to poor choices and worse circumstances. But also, like her classmates, Carmen had decided that the past didn't have to determine the future. "It's hard," Carmen said quietly. "Writing about things you're not proud of, knowing other people are going to read it and judge you for it." Rebecca pulled up a chair beside Carmen's desk. After 18 months of teaching adults who'd been written off by traditional educational systems, she'd learned that sometimes the most important lessons happened in these quiet moments between. "Formal instruction. Can I tell you something?" Rebecca said. 2 years ago, I stood in a federal courtroom and told my entire story to a room full of strangers, knowing that every mistake I'd made would be examined, criticized, and probably used against me. I was terrified. Carmen nodded, recognizing something in Rebecca's tone that went beyond professional sympathy. "But you know what I learned? The people who were going to judge me harshly were going to do that no matter how perfect I tried to appear. And the people who mattered, the ones whose opinions actually affected my life, they cared more about my honesty than my history." "What happened?" Carmen asked. "In that courtroom, I mean." Rebecca glanced around the classroom, where other students were deep in their work, building futures from the fragments of interrupted educations and delayed dreams. These were her people now, not because they were broken, but because they refused to stay that way. "Justice happened," she said simply. "Not the Hollywood kind where everything gets fixed and everyone lives happily ever after, but the real kind, where people face consequences for their actions and survivors get the chance to rebuild." Viktor Kozlov had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The corruption investigation in Chicago had resulted in 14 indictments, including Danny Walsh, who was currently serving 12 years for conspiracy, and Sarah Chen's murder. Rebecca's father had received 5 years for money laundering, reduced to 18 months because of his cooperation with federal investigators. The convictions had been satisfying in an abstract way, but Rebecca had discovered that justice felt less like victory and more like the opportunity to stop looking over her shoulder and start looking ahead. "The real reward," she continued, "wasn't seeing bad people punished. It was realizing that I'd found the courage to tell the truth about myself, even when it was dangerous. And that once you do that, once you stop hiding from your own story, you discover you're stronger than you ever imagined." Carmen smiled and turned back to her essay with renewed determination. Rebecca moved on to help other students, but her mind drifted to the phone call she'd received that morning from Agent Rodriguez, now retired from the FBI and working as a private security consultant. "Thought you'd want to know," he'd said. "We picked up Marcus Thompson yesterday, not for anything criminal," he'd added quickly, recognizing her sharp intake of breath. "He's been accepted to law school at Vanderbilt, full scholarship. Apparently, his personal statement about overcoming adversity and finding mentors who believed in second chances made quite an impression on the admissions committee." Rebecca had smiled at that news. Marcus had finished his undergraduate degree, while working full-time, had spent months in counseling, dealing with the aftermath of their relationship and its consequences, and had slowly rebuilt his life on a foundation of hard-won wisdom rather than naive optimism. "He wanted me to give you a message," Rodriguez had continued. "He said to tell you that he's learned the difference between gratitude and guilt, and that he's grateful for the lessons you taught him, even the hard ones." Now, as Rebecca watched her students work toward goals they'd once thought impossible, she thought about the ripple effects of choices made in crisis moments. Marcus had found his path to law school. Carmen was 6 months away from her GED and had already been accepted to community college. James... The classroom door opened, interrupting her thoughts. James Crawford entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the relaxed expression of a man who'd finally made peace with his past. After the trial, he joined Agent Rodriguez's security firm, specializing in protecting witnesses and survivors of organized crime. The work was dangerous but meaningful, and it allowed him to use his skills in service of people who, like him, had chosen courage over safety. "Thought you might need caffeine," he said, settling into the chair behind Rebecca's desk. "How's the morning going?" "Good. Carmen's working on her personal essay, David passed his math practice test, and Maria just told me she's been accepted to the nursing program at Portland Community College." James smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that still caught Rebecca off guard sometimes. They'd been together for over a year now, not the desperate connection of two people clinging to each other in crisis, but the deeper partnership of two individuals who'd learned to stand alone and chose to stand together. "Speaking of good news," James said, "I got a call from Sarah's sister this morning." Rebecca looked up from the papers she was grading. James rarely spoke about his late fiancé's family, though she knew he'd reconnected with them after the trial, finally able to offer them the closure that comes with justice served. "Linda's getting married next month," James continued. "She asked if we'd like to come to the wedding. Said Sarah would have wanted the people who helped bring her killers to justice to be part of the celebration. What did you tell her?" "I told her we'd be honored." Rebecca reached across the desk to touch his hand, feeling the familiar strength and steadiness that had drawn her to him in those first dark days when they'd been nothing more than two strangers sharing their worst moments over whiskey and coffee. "Sarah would be proud of what you've built here," James said, looking around the classroom where adults from every imaginable background were working toward futures they'd almost given up on. "We've built," Rebecca corrected. "You're the one who convinced the city to fund this program. You're the one who found the building, recruited half the volunteers, and talked 3 major employers into guaranteeing job interviews for graduates." In Millbrook, Tennessee, they still whispered about the teacher who'd fallen from grace. But in Portland, Oregon, she was simply Rebecca Crawford, educator, survivor, and living proof that sometimes the most beautiful thing about a person is not their perfection, but their refusal to let their worst moment be their last word. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, delivered by a postal worker who had no idea he was carrying a piece of Rebecca's past into her carefully constructed present. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting on the envelope made her heart skip with recognition. Marcus Thompson had grown into his penmanship over the years, but Rebecca could still see traces of the uncertain teenager who'd once stayed after class to discuss essay assignments and life dreams in equal measure. She opened the letter while James made breakfast, their morning routine now as comfortable and predictable as breathing. Outside their kitchen window, cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom, painting their quiet neighborhood in delicate shades of pink and white. "Dear Rebecca," the letter began, and she noticed immediately that he'd dropped the formal Miss Hayes he'd used even during their relationship, another sign of the man he'd become rather than the boy he'd been. "I hope this letter finds you well and happy. I got your address from Agent Rodriguez, who assured me you wouldn't mind hearing from me. I wanted to reach out because I'm graduating from law school next month, and there are things I need to say before I officially become the kind of person who gets paid to have opinions about justice and accountability." Rebecca smiled at that phrase, recognizing the wit and intelligence that had first drawn her attention to Marcus as a student, long before their relationship had complicated everything. "First, I want you to know that I've spent the last 4 years in therapy, not because I was damaged by what happened between us, but because I wanted to understand my own role in creating a situation that hurt so many people. Dr. Martinez helped me realize that while I was legally an adult when our relationship began, I was emotionally still very much a teenager looking for someone to save me from my problems at home. That's not your fault, but it's also not something I should have asked of you, even implicitly." James glanced over at the letter in Rebecca's hands, noting her absorbed expression, but didn't interrupt. They'd learned to give each other space for processing the complicated legacy of their past lives, understanding that healing wasn't linear and sometimes required revisiting old wounds with new wisdom. "The thing is, I've realized that gratitude and guilt aren't the same thing, though I confused them for years. I was grateful for your belief in my potential, for the way you saw intelligence and possibility in a kid whose own parents had written him off as a disappointment. But I felt guilty about the cost of that connection, both to you and to me." Doctor Martinez helped me understand that I could hold on to the gratitude while letting go of the guilt. Rebecca felt tears forming as she read, remembering the earnest young man who'd tried so hard to shoulder blame that belonged to both of them in different measures. "I'm writing now because I start work next week at the Tennessee Coalition Against Domestic Violence, representing survivors, in cases where their abusers have institutional power. Cases where victims need advocates who understand what it's like to be caught in systems that seem designed to punish you for other people's crimes. It's work that matters to me because of what I learned watching you navigate the aftermath of our relationship. You showed me what it looks like to face consequences with dignity, to tell difficult truths even when they cost you everything, and to refuse to let other people's judgment define your worth." James set a cup of coffee beside Rebecca's elbow, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture of support and understanding. "There's something else I need to tell you. Last month I received a call from a reporter at the Nashville scene who wanted to do a follow-up story about the Kozlov trial and its impact on the communities involved. She'd interviewed several people in Millbrook, and apparently there's been a shift in how some people talk about what happened." Rebecca's pulse quickened. She'd deliberately avoided seeking out information about Millbrook in the years since the trial, preferring to focus on building her new life rather than dwelling on the old one. "Mrs. Chen, you remember her? She always volunteered for the school book fairs. She told the reporter that she wished more people had spoken up for you when the scandal first broke. She said she'd realized afterward that the whole situation was more complicated than anyone had understood at the time, and that you'd been made into a scapegoat for a criminal conspiracy that none of us even knew existed." Rebecca remembered Mrs. Chen's grandson, Jimmy, who'd needed help with college applications. She wondered if he'd made it through his degree program, if he was building the kind of life that his grandmother's sacrifice and determination had been meant to secure. Even Principal Morrison, and I know this will surprise you, admitted to the reporter that he'd been under pressure from the school board to make an example of you, even though he personally believed the situation was more nuanced than the headlines suggested. He said that if he'd known then what came out during the trial, he would have handled things very differently. Rebecca felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness at that news. Principal Morrison had been a good administrator and a decent man caught in an impossible situation. She didn't blame him for choosing the school's reputation over her career, but it was oddly comforting to know that he'd questioned that choice. In hindsight, I tell you this, not because I think you need their approval or recognition. You've clearly built something meaningful with your life, regardless of what people in Tennessee think about it. But because I thought you deserved to know that time and truth have a way of changing narratives, even when it feels like the damage is permanent. Rebecca looked up from the letter to find James watching her with gentle concern. "Good news or complicated news?" he asked. "Both," she said. "Marcus is graduating law school and starting work with a domestic violence advocacy group, and apparently some people in Millbrook have developed more nuanced opinions about what happened. How does that feel?" Rebecca considered the question, while Marcus's words settled into the deeper understanding she'd developed about forgiveness, justice, and the long arc of healing. 2 years ago, she would have been desperate for this kind of recognition, would have seen it as validation that she wasn't the monster people had painted her to be. Now it felt like information about a different person's life. Relevant, but not central to her current identity. I'm including my business card because I want you to know how to reach me if you ever need anything. Not because I think you're helpless or because I feel I owe you something, but because you're someone who helped shape who I became, and I believe in maintaining connections with people who've contributed to our growth. Even when those connections are complicated. Rebecca turned over the business card Marcus had included. Marcus A. Thompson, J.D., Staff Attorney, Tennessee Coalition Against Domestic Violence. The professional formatting couldn't hide her pride in the man he'd become, the way he'd channeled their shared experience into work that protected other vulnerable people. Finally, I want you to know that I've been following the work you're doing. With the Second Chance Learning Center, Agent Rodriguez mentioned it when we spoke, and I looked up your program online. What you've created, this space for people society has written off to rebuild their lives through education, it seems like the perfect expression of who you always were as a teacher, not the scandal, not the mistakes, but the person who saw potential in difficult students and refused to give up on them. James was making scrambled eggs now, the familiar sounds of their morning routine, a counterpoint to the emotional weight of Marcus's letter. Rebecca felt grateful for this ordinary moment, this life they'd built that was grounded in daily choices rather than dramatic gestures. I hope you'll consider this an open invitation. If you're ever in Tennessee, I'd be honored to show you the work we're doing here. And if any of your students in Portland ever need legal advocacy or just someone to talk to who understands what it's like to rebuild after everything falls apart, please don't hesitate to reach out. With gratitude, respect, and hopes for your continued happiness, Marcus P.S. I kept one thing from our time together, the copy of The Great Gatsby you gave me with your notes in the margins. I still reread your comments sometimes, especially the one where you wrote, "The green light represents hope that's always just out of reach, but maybe the reaching is more important than the catching." I think about that a lot in my work now. Rebecca set the letter down and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at their neighborhood coming to life. Children waiting for school buses, neighbors walking dogs, the postal worker continuing his route with no idea of the small earthquake he'd delivered to their quiet Tuesday morning. "Want to talk about it?" James asked, sliding a plate of eggs and toast across the counter to her. "He's become exactly the kind of person I hoped he would when I first met him," Rebecca said. "Someone who channels his pain into helping others, who understands the difference between justice and revenge, who's learned to forgive without forgetting. That sounds like someone else I know." Rebecca smiled at the gentle teasing in James's voice. They'd both changed so much from the broken people who'd met in Murphy's bar that sometimes she felt like they were entirely different individuals wearing familiar faces. "James, do you think we should go to Marcus's graduation?" The question surprised them both. Rebecca hadn't planned to ask it, but now that the words were out, she realized she'd been wondering about it since the first paragraph of his letter. "Do you want to go?" "I think I want to witness the completion of his journey, not as his former teacher or his former whatever I was to him, but as someone who cares about his success and wants to celebrate this milestone with him." James was quiet for a moment, understanding the complexity of what she was proposing. It would mean returning to Tennessee for the first time since the trial, facing whatever reactions their presence might provoke, stepping back into a history they'd both worked hard to transcend. "If it's important to you, then we'll go," he said finally, "though we should probably bring security with us." Agent Rodriguez. He'd insist anyway once he heard we were planning to be in Tennessee. Old habits. That afternoon, Rebecca called Marcus's office number, unsure what she'd say, but knowing she needed to respond to his letter personally rather than in writing. His secretary put her through immediately, and when Marcus's voice came through the phone, deeper now, more confident, but still carrying traces of the thoughtful teenager she'd known, she felt a rush of maternal pride that had nothing to do with their complicated history. "Marcus, it's Rebecca. I got your letter this morning." "Rebecca, I'm so glad you called. I wasn't sure if reaching out was appropriate, but I felt like there were things I needed to say. Your letter was beautiful, and I'm incredibly proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you. That means more to me than you probably realize." They talked for nearly an hour, catching up on the intervening years with the careful intimacy of people who'd shared something profound, but had learned to maintain appropriate boundaries around that experience. Marcus told her about law school, about his work with domestic violence survivors, about the relationship he'd built with a fellow attorney who understood the complexities of his past. Rebecca shared stories from the Learning Center, described the satisfaction of watching adults achieve goals they'd thought were impossible, mentioned James and the life they'd built together without dwelling on details that weren't Marcus's business to know. "I have to ask," Marcus said as their conversation began winding down, "are you happy, really happy, not just making the best of things?" "I'm fulfilled," Rebecca said after considering the question carefully. "I'm doing work that matters with someone I love and respect. I'm not the person I was when we knew each other, but I think I'm a better version of myself than I was then." That's all any of us can hope for, isn't it? To become better versions of ourselves. Before they hung up, Rebecca made a decision that surprised her with its certainty. "Marcus, James and I would like to come to your graduation if you'd be uncomfortable with that." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Rebecca wondered if she'd overstepped. But then Marcus's voice came back warm with emotion. "I would be honored to have you there, both of you." 3 weeks later, Rebecca and James sat in the back row of Vanderbilt Law School's graduation ceremony, watching as Marcus Thompson walked across the stage to receive his diploma. Agent Rodriguez sat beside them in a suit that couldn't quite hide the fact that he was armed and alert, but his presence felt more like family protection than federal security. When Marcus's name was called, Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, not for the boy he'd been or the relationship they'd shared, but for the man he'd become despite everything that had tried to break him. In the audience around them, she could see Marcus's parents, his girlfriend, his colleagues from the Domestic Violence Coalition, all celebrating this moment that represented triumph over circumstances that could have destroyed him. After the ceremony, Marcus found them in the crowd, and Rebecca was struck by how much he'd grown, not just in height and maturity, but in the quiet confidence that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. "Thank you for coming," he said, embracing Rebecca with the careful affection of someone who'd learned the difference between love and need. "It wouldn't have felt complete without you here." "We wouldn't have missed it," James said, shaking Marcus's, and with the respect of one survivor recognizing another. As they walked across campus together, Marcus introduced them to his colleagues and friends with simple honesty. "These are my friends Rebecca and James from Portland. Rebecca was my high school English teacher, and they both played important roles in helping me understand what justice actually looks like. No scandal, no drama, no need to explain or justify or apologize. Just recognition that some relationships, no matter how they begin or where they lead, become part of the foundation on which we build our better selves." That evening, over dinner at a quiet restaurant near campus, Marcus shared his plans for the future, the cases he wanted to take on, the systemic changes he hoped to advocate. For the family he someday wanted to build with his partner Sarah. Sarah's also a lawyer. he explained. She works with immigration cases, helping families stay together when the system tries to tear them apart. We bonded over our shared belief that the law should protect vulnerable people, not just powerful ones. Rebecca smiled at that, remembering the idealistic young man who'd written essays about justice and fairness, with the passionate certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned how complicated both concepts could be in practice. "That sounds like the perfect partnership," she said. "We think so, and we're hoping you'll come to our wedding next year, both of you." The invitation was offered with the same genuine warmth that had characterized their entire reunion, and Rebecca realized that this was what redemption actually looked like. Not the dramatic Hollywood version where past sins were magically erased, but the quieter reality where broken relationships could heal into something different but equally valuable. As they prepared to leave Tennessee the next morning, Rebecca stood on the hotel balcony, looking out at the mountains that surrounded Nashville, thinking about the journey that had brought her from scandal to this moment of unexpected peace, ready to go home. James asked, loading their suitcases into the rental car. Rebecca took one last look at the Tennessee landscape that had once represented exile and shame, but now felt simply like part of her story. Important, but not determinative. Painful, but ultimately transformative. "More than ready," she said. "We've got students waiting for us." As they drove toward the airport, Rebecca felt the deep satisfaction that comes from completing a circle, from returning to a place of pain and finding it transformed by time, truth, and the persistent human capacity for growth. Behind them, Marcus was beginning his career as an advocate for the vulnerable. Ahead of them, 30 adults were waiting for their next lesson in the power of second chances, and in the space between past and future, Rebecca Crawford, formerly Rebecca Hayes, rode beside the man she loved toward a life that proved every day that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the words, "I'm not pure anymore," and end with the recognition that purity was never the point. Courage was. Love was. The willingness to keep becoming better than you were yesterday was. In Millbrook, Tennessee, they still whispered about the teacher who'd fallen from grace. But in Portland, Oregon, she was simply Rebecca Crawford, educator, survivor, and living. Proof that sometimes the most beautiful thing about a person is not their perfection, but their refusal to let their worst moment be their last word. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.